Machine subjectivity. Term associated with Felix Guattari that refers to semiotic productions of the mass media, of computers, of telecommunications, robotics, etc., outside of psychological subjectivity. For Guattari, the technologies of information and communication serve to reorient and transform the thinking of subjectivity in terms of heterogeneous semiotic flows. Machinic subjectivity is productive, polyphonic and irreducibly multiform rather than unifying. However, while it may be productive in hitherto undreamt of ways, Guattari warns that machine subjectivity has the potential for a mind-numbing mass mediatization. Manicheanism. Belief in a kind of philosophical or religious dualism. Masculinity. Femininity. Binary opposition, which refers to the construction of attributes of identity associated with or based on a given individual's sexuality or gender-ascribed perspectives and/or culturally encoded value systems concerning behavior. Masquerade. In contemporary gender theory, the concept of masquerade, derived from the writings of Joan Riviere, is central, particularly her essay Womanliness as a Masquerade, 1929. It argues that gender is a performance rather than a natural phenomenon with which one is born. It has to be acquired, learned and polished, and is in no sense natural. Mass culture. Term often associated with British cultural theorist Richard Hoggart that refers to a new commercialized social order that finds its roots in the mass dissemination of television, radio, magazines and a variety of other media. In Hoggart's view, mass culture shapes and reconstructs cultural, social, and intellectual life in its image and via its mediated depiction of artificial levels of reality. Master. Slave dialectic. Hegel's model for understanding the interaction between two self-consciousnesses and the manner in which each entity considers the other in terms of the self. Hegel argues that this admittedly primitive model reveals the ways in which each figure functions as a mirror for the other and ultimately eschews cooperation because of their inherently subordinate relationship. Materialism. Doctrine or system of beliefs that maintains that economic or social change occurs via material well-being rather than intellectual or spiritual phenomena. Mediation. Concept of textual transformation, often employed in Marxist and other materialist criticisms, which supersedes reductive or crude models of reflection, which assume either that the economic base is reflected in its cultural superstructure or that any given text simply reflects the world, instead of mediating that image and thereby shaping or influencing the reader's comprehension in a particular way. Also, the notion of mediation is employed to suggest that the text is itself not a simple recording or representation, but is influenced in its shaping by a number of factors, including matters of historical, cultural and ideological relation. Metacriticism. Critical mode which takes the act of criticism, its principles, processes, concerns and interests, as its principal subject. Works such as Terry Eagleton's literary theory, an introduction or Jonathan Culler's structuralist poetics are, typically, works definable as metacritical. Metafiction. A fictional mode that takes fictionality, the conventions of writing fiction, as part of its own subject matter. Metahistory. Analysis of principles governing historical narrative or the structures of such narrative. Metalanguage. Roman Jacobson defines metalanguage as any form of language which defines linguistic properties. Following the work of Alfred Tarski, Colin McCabe describes metalanguage which announces its object languages as material and signals them so through the conventions of the imposition of quotation marks and other diacritical markers, while assuming an implicit transparency for itself. Thus, for McCabe, the narrator or narrative voice in a realist novel assumes the role of the metalanguage in that it appears to observe rather than to interpret or analyze. Metaphysics. originally derived from the order of Aristotle's works, where all writings that did not fit within the various disciplines were put together in a volume next to the physics. Metaphysics has come to mean the total structure of a philosophical system, trying to determine being as such and in general. Accordingly, metaphysical systems differ according to the relation they posit between ontology, the philosophy of being, epistemology, ethics and politics. At the same time, metaphysics characterizes a thinking that determines the physical by means of a principle that resides outside of this world, such as God, for example. One distinguishes between a metaphysicus specialis, concerning questions for the divine being, immortality and freedom, and a metaphysica generalis, determining the meaning of being as such and in general. Mimesis can be used in two distinct ways. First, mimesis, from the Greek mimos, a mime, refers to the imitation or representation of reality in art. Mimesis can also be used to describe the process by which one writing mimics another kind. For example, a fiction might pretend to be a historical document in order to gain authority for its account. Mimicry. Generally, the practice, act or art of imitation, often for the purpose of ridicule. Homi K. Bhabha uses the term to identify a form of colonial control of its subjects. The colonizer seeks to impose on the colonial subject the forms and values of the colonial master, so the Anglicization of Indians and Africans during British colonial rule. However, as Bhabha identifies, there remains a gap between the desire to erase difference, indicated by Bhabha in the phrase not white, from which emerges ambivalence. Mirror phase. Jacques Lacan posited that a baby, at first an oceanic bundle of undifferentiated desire who believes himself to be continuous with the larger world in his mother, first comes to a realization of himself as a unitary and separate being when, at age 6 to 18 months, he first sees his own reflection in a mirror. For Lacan, this is the beginning of the ego's development, but it is significantly founded on a misapprehension, since the image in the mirror is signified a substitute image of the self, not the self itself. Hence, the mirror phase implies that the ego is founded on highly unstable grounds, rather than in any essential personality. Mise and abyme. From the French for placed into the abysses, mise and abyme has come to mean narrative or philosophical moments of infinite regression. Although Chinese boxes or other infinite regressive features are often used for comic effect, the French term emphasizes the terror of emptiness that is also part of the free play of language, where language has only the most tangential, arbitrary and conventionalized relationships with reality. Mnemotechnic. Literally, the work of memory or that which memory causes to appear. The concept of mnemotechnic combines the idea of involuntary memory, the idea that memory is not passively stored in the mind, but is, instead, an active force which can return without conscious effort, with that of impersonal memory, through the effects of chance association and signification. Thus a literary text may be said to be produced out of, while actively producing, preserving and remembering personal, social and cultural pasts beyond the immediate intentions of the author. Mode of production. Marxist concept in the theory of historical materialism that accounts for the historical conditions by which productive forces such as labor, the workforce, technology, materials, and tools combine, in particular, historically determined ways with distribution of wealth, social power structures, ownership and control of power relations in society, the law, and class relations to form an organic totality which maintains and sustains social and economic order. Modernism. Term referring to the literary, artistic and general culture of the first half of the 20th century. Modernism is distinguished by its general rejection of previous literary traditions, particularly those of the late 19th century and a bourgeois society. In addition to involving an existentialist view of the universe, Modernists explore myth as a device of formal organization. Modernity. From one perspective, modernity may be defined as the condition of embracing or reflecting the value systems inherent in modernism's intellectual value systems, as modernism signifies a project identifiable with intellectual and artistic projects of the early 20th century. However, the idea of modernity is a vexed one, not least because there is little agreement as to where the moment of modernity, whether in epistemological terms or in terms of modes of production and social and economic relations, emerges historically. There are arguments that initial instances of modernity or early modernity are coterminous with the development of notions of subjectivity, corporeality and autonomy in the Renaissance, or, as it is alternatively described, the early modern period, typified by the emergence of humanist thought. On the other hand, modernity is also identified as a specifically Enlightenment project, related in particular to the thinking of the inevitability of progress. At the same time, the emergence of modernity has been assigned to the transition between feudal social formations and the emergence of the nation-state, the beginning of colonial enterprise, and nascent manifestations of pre-capitalist modes of production. Whichever cultural, intellectual and historical set of circumstances one identifies with or is the idea of the modern, what is consistent in these arguments is the idea that modernity emerges as a struggle, critical tension or even break with its forebears. At the same time, it is argued that that which is comprehended as modern, while opening a gap between its own instance and the past, still bears traces of that past in its own thinking. Another aspect of the conceptualization of modernity, drawn chiefly from the work of Martin Heidegger and Walter Benjamin, is a transformation in the relationships between society and technology, relationships which are examined extensively in the work of, for example, Paul Virilio, Giorgio Agamben and Gianni Vattimo. Molar. Molecular. Terms employed in the work of Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari to describe the processes constituting the organization of the human subject. The molar signifies the territorially defined stability of conscious awareness. The molecular are those unconscious elements in their multiplicities which constitute the flows of desiring machines, which are brought to a halt and thereby stabilized or otherwise excluded within the molar organization of consciousness. It is the function of psychanalysis to destabilize and deterritorialize the flows in their molar organization, so as to accommodate without limiting the processes of molecular becoming. Monist. A person who reduces all phenomena to a single viewpoint or principle, also, a given individual who views reality as the product of a singular, unified vision, rather than as the sum of a series of component parts. Monist analysis that focuses solely or primarily on one form of domination, for example, gender, race or class. Monologism. Term coined by Mikhail Bakhtin to describe characters representing multiple points of view, while being clearly dominated by a single voice or ideology. Morpheme. The smallest linguistic or structural unit of language. Multiculturalism. Refers to the social and political movement and/or position that views differences between individuals and groups to be a potential venue of cultural strength and renewal. Multiculturalism celebrates and explores different varieties of experience stemming from racial, ethnic, gender, sexual and/or class differences. Multiplicative analysis. Analysis developed by feminists of color. It seeks to account for the experiences of people who have been subordinated to several forms of domination. Whereas an additive approach would see, for example, race, class and gender as three discrete systems that accumulate oppressions on poor women of color, a multiplicative approach analyses how race and class change the meanings of gender, how race and gender change the meanings of class, and how class and gender change the meanings of race. A multiplicative approach highlights the differential experiences of women of color rather than their double or triple oppression. Finally, a multiplicative approach is contextual and historically informed. It recognizes that in certain cases, one of the features, race, gender, class, sexuality, etc., may be more salient than the others. Also called multi-axial analysis or intersectionality. Myth. The traditional story of pseudo-historical events that functions as a fundamental element within the worldview of a given people or nation. Myths are similarly employed by human communities to attempt to explain the nature of various practices, beliefs or natural phenomena. Mytheme. Neologism coined by Claude Levi-Strauss to indicate the structural elements or units that recur in different narrative, mythological structures, based on his understanding of the analogical similarity between the structural forms of linguistics in myth. Metalepsis. Substitution of one metonym with another, or more generally, any series of successive figurative supplements.